The Grand Study Hall of the Vareth Interstellar Academy was the quietest place in the known galaxy. It had been that way for 12,000 cycles. The hall was built from living crystal that grew from the walls like frozen rivers, and the crystal did something strange to sound. It swallowed it. Every whisper, every footstep, every breath was pulled into the walls and dissolved into nothing. Students who entered the hall for the first time often described the feeling as drowning on dry land. The silence was not empty. It was heavy, thick, and alive. Kethri pressed her wings flat against her back and walked between the rows of study platforms. She was a chelith, an insectoid species with 4 arms, 2 legs, and a pair of delicate wings that folded along her spine like sheets of dark glass. Her compound eyes reflected the blue glow of the crystal walls in 100 tiny copies. She was young, barely into her second molting cycle, and she had worked harder than anyone in her hive cluster to earn a place at this academy. She was not going to waste it. She found her usual platform near the eastern wall, set down her data tablets and began reading. Around her, the hall was filled with students from across the galaxy. A group of Saurons sat near the center, massive reptilian creatures with armored hides and jaws that could crush stone. They studied with their eyes half closed, their thick tails curled around the bases of their seats. Near the back, a pair of Ulwai drifted above their platforms like clouds of pale light. The Ulwai were gas-form beings, ancient and wise, and they communicated through shifts in pressure and color rather than sound. They were considered the most intelligent species in the known systems. There were others too. The Dravni, small and quick with 6 eyes that never blinked. The Olesi, tall and thin as blades of grass, their skin shifting color with their moods. The Kreth, who looked like walking trees and smelled like rain. Each species had earned its place here through centuries of civilization, through wars fought and treaties signed, through science and art and the long, slow climb from dirt to stars. This was the finest school in the galaxy, and it had a rule that every student learned on their first day. The Grand Study Hall was sacred. You did not speak in the hall. You did not run. You did not fight. You did not make noise of any kind. The silence was a tradition older than most species in the room, and to break it was to insult every generation that had studied here before you. Kethri respected the silence. She loved it. In the quiet, she could think clearly. She could feel her mind stretching outward like roots searching for water. She could forget for a little while that she was far from her hive, far from her cluster sisters, alone in a way that no chelith was ever meant to be alone. She was deep in a text on quantum diplomacy when the whispers started. They were not spoken whispers. No one would dare make sound in the hall. They were digital, messages flickering across data tablets, passed from student to student like sparks jumping between wires. Kethri felt her own tablet vibrate and looked down. The message was from Voreth, a Sauron student she shared a diplomatic theory class with. It contained only 2 words. It's confirmed. She did not need to ask what was confirmed. Everyone already knew. The rumor had been crawling through the academy for weeks, growing louder with each passing day, impossible to ignore no matter how hard the instructors tried to maintain order. A human was coming to the Vareth Academy. Kethri set down her tablet and stared at the crystal wall in front of her. She had never seen a human. Very few people in the academy had. Humans were a young species, absurdly young by galactic standards. They had only made contact with the wider galaxy 500 cycles ago, which was barely a heartbeat in the life of civilizations that measured their histories in tens of thousands of years. Most species considered humans to be newcomers, barely worth attention. But that was not the whole truth, and everyone knew it. There were stories. Every species had them. The Sauron soldiers spoke of humans in low voices, the way they might speak of a disease that had no cure. The Ulwai elders, who rarely expressed emotion of any kind, had been known to change color at the mention of Earth, the human homeworld. Even the Dravni, who feared almost nothing because their 6 eyes could see in every direction at once, avoided human space. Kethri had tried to research them. The galactic archives contained surprisingly little. Humans had a single planet of origin, a small blue-green world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. The planet was classified as a Category 12 death world, which meant it had active tectonics, extreme weather, a molten core, an atmosphere full of corrosive oxygen, and a biosphere so aggressive that its creatures spent most of their existence trying to eat each other. Somehow, humans had not only survived on this world, they had conquered it. Every land mass, every ocean, every climate zone from frozen poles to boiling equator. And then they had reached for the stars. The archives were vague about how they had done it. The records mentioned wars, many wars, fought not against other species, but against each other. They mentioned weapons that could crack a planet open like an egg. They mentioned art so beautiful that it had been placed in the permanent collection of the HFY Cultural Preserve. They mentioned music, mathematics, medicine, and madness, all tangled together in a species that seemed incapable of deciding whether it wanted to create or destroy. HFY closed the archive files and felt a cold tightness in her thorax. She was a scientist. She did not believe in monsters, but something about the human entry in the galactic record made her feel the way she had felt as a larva, pressed against the wall of her birthing chamber, listening to the sound of a storm tearing across the surface above. It was not fear exactly. It was the knowledge that something was coming and she could not stop it. The next morning, Headmaster Dreven made the announcement. Dreven was an ancient HFY, vast and slow-moving, a cloud of silver light that filled whatever room it occupied. When it spoke, the air itself seemed to vibrate with authority. The announcement was short. Tomorrow, it said, a human student would arrive. He would be given the same rights and responsibilities as every other student. He would be treated with respect. There would be no exceptions. Dreven said nothing else. It offered no explanation for why a human had been admitted, no reassurance that everything would be fine. The silence it left behind was heavier than the silence of the grand study hall. That night, HFY lay in her sleeping alcove and stared at the ceiling. Around her, the residential wing hummed with the quiet sounds of 100 species trying to rest. She could hear the deep rumble of Sauron breathing, the soft chime of HFY pressure shifts, the clicking of Dravni claws on metal floors. Tomorrow, a human would walk into the academy, a creature from a death world, a predator with forward-facing eyes and an evolutionary history written in blood and fire. She pulled her wings tighter around her body and tried to sleep. She did not succeed. The grand study hall had never been so full. Every seat was taken. Every platform was occupied. Students who had not visited the hall in weeks suddenly found urgent reasons to study there that morning. The Saurons sat in tight clusters, their armored bodies angled toward the main entrance. The Chelith grouped together by instinct, their wings pressed flat, their compound eyes reflecting the same door from 1,000 angles. Even the HFY, who normally drifted through the upper reaches of the hall like distant clouds, had descended to hover just above the crystal platforms, their gas forms dense and watchful. No one was reading. Every tablet was open, every page displayed, but no eyes moved across text. The entire hall was holding its breath. HFY sat in her usual spot near the eastern wall. She had arrived early before the rush, and she had watched the hall fill with a growing sense of dread that she could not fully explain. She was a scientist. She studied facts. She solved problems. She did not panic over the arrival of a single student, no matter what species he belonged to. And yet her wings had been locked against her back since she woke up. That had not happened since she was a larva. The morning light cycle activated and the crystal walls shifted from deep blue to pale gold. The hall brightened. The silence deepened. And then, without warning, the great doors at the northern end of the hall opened. He walked in alone. The first thing HFY noticed was how small he was. She had expected something enormous, something with bulk and mass and obvious danger, like a Sauron or one of the heavy-gravity species from the outer systems. But the human was average in height, shorter than most Sauron, thinner than the Olissi, and completely without any visible natural weapons. No claws, no fangs, no armor plating, no venom glands, no spines, no horns, no bioluminescent threat displays. He had soft skin, pale and smooth, stretched over a frame of lean muscle and thin bone. His hands were bare and blunt-fingered. His body was wrapped in a simple dark uniform that carried no rank markings, no clan symbols, no identifying features of any kind. He had dark hair cut short and a face that was flat and open, with a small nose and a mouth that seemed too soft for a predator. But then saw his eyes, and something deep inside her went cold. They were forward-facing, both of them, set into the front of his skull like targeting sensors, aimed straight ahead with absolute focus. Every prey species in the galaxy had eyes on the sides of their heads, wide-set, designed to watch for danger from every direction. Eyes on the front of the skull meant only one thing. It meant the creature did not need to watch for danger. It meant the creature was the danger. It meant it was built to track, to chase, to lock onto a single target and never look away. The human's eyes swept the room. They moved slowly, steadily, taking in every face, every species, every corner of the hall. There was no nervousness in the movement, no hesitation. He was not scanning for threats. He was simply observing, the way a creature observes a landscape it intends to cross. He began walking toward the study platforms. His footsteps were almost silent on the crystal floor. He moved with a smoothness that was deeply wrong, not the careful movement of a prey animal trying to avoid detection, but the relaxed stride of something that had no natural predators. His body was loose. His shoulders were down. His breathing was even and slow. He passed within 3 body lengths of a group of Sauron. The largest of them, a senior student named HFY, who stood nearly 3 meters tall and weighed as much as a ground transport, shifted in his seat. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but HFY saw it clearly. HFY, who had once broken a training drone apart with his bare hands, had leaned away from the human. The human did not notice, or if he noticed, he did not care. He found an empty platform near the center of the hall. He unslung his bag from his shoulder, a battered thing made of some kind of animal skin, brown and worn soft with age. He sat down. He opened the bag and pulled out a small paper book, not a data tablet, not a holo display, but an actual book made from the pulped flesh of dead trees. He opened it, settled into his seat and began to read. And then he did the worst thing had ever seen. He smiled. It was a small expression. Just a slight upward curve of his lips as he read something that amused him. But when his lips moved, his teeth showed. They were white and flat and lined up in a neat row behind his lips, and when they caught the light, they gleamed. Across the galaxy, the baring of teeth meant one thing. It was a threat. It was a display of weapons. It was the universal signal of a creature preparing to bite, to tear, to feed. Every species in the hall knew this in their bones, in their blood, in the ancient parts of their brains that had kept their ancestors alive long before civilization was a word. The Sauron went still, all of them at the same time like a herd that had spotted a predator in the tall grass. The Chelith pulled closer together. A young Dravni near the back of the hall made a soft clicking sound, a fear response that broke the sacred silence of the hall for the first time anyone could remember. No one corrected him. No one even looked. The HFY student nearest to Jakob compressed its gas form into a tight sphere, drawing itself inward like a creature retreating into a shell. The color of its body shifted from calm silver to pale yellow, the HFY expression of deep unease. Jakob turned a page of his book. He did not look up. He did not seem to know or care that every living being in the room was watching him. He crossed one leg over the other, rested his chin on his hand, and kept reading. The silence of the grand study hall had always been heavy, but now it was something else. It was the silence of 100 species sitting perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, because there was a predator in the room and some part of their ancient brains was screaming at them to run. and the predator was reading a paper book and smiling to himself. HFY realized that her lower hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against the surface of her platform and forced herself to breathe. She was a scientist. She dealt in facts. The human had done nothing threatening. He had walked in, sat down, and opened a book. That was all. But facts were not the problem. The problem was something older than facts, older than science, older than language itself. The problem was that every cell in her body was telling her that she was sitting in a room with something that could kill her, and it was comfortable here, and it was patient, and it was not afraid of anything. She watched him read for another hour. He never looked up. He never shifted in his seat. He never made a sound. He simply sat in the sacred silence of the grand study hall as though he had been born in it. That was the most frightening part of all. Every species in the galaxy found the silence of the hall uncomfortable. It was a discipline, something to be endured and respected. But the human did not endure the silence. He enjoyed it. Predators were silent creatures. They had to be. Silence was how they hunted. Silence was how they waited. Silence was how they watched their prey from the shadows and chose the perfect moment to strike. The human sat in the silence like he was home. When the evening light cycle began and the crystal walls shifted to deep purple, the students filed out of the hall one by one. They moved quietly, carefully, giving the human's platform a wide space as they passed. Jakob did not look up from his book until the hall was nearly empty. Then he closed the book, placed it in his bag, stood up, and walked out through the great doors. He had not spoken a single word to anyone. He had not needed to. His presence had said everything. That night, the residential wing was louder than usual. Students talked in hushed voices behind closed doors. Messages flew across data networks. Fear spread through the academy like heat through metal, invisible but impossible to ignore. HFY lay in her sleeping alcove and thought about forward-facing eyes. She thought about the way he had walked through a room full of species that could crush him, dissolve him, or tear him apart, and he had not been afraid. She thought about his smile, those white, flat teeth gleaming in the crystal light. She did not sleep well that night either. Days passed. The human did nothing wrong. That was the problem. Jakob Morrow attended every class. He arrived on time, sat in whatever seat was available, which was always the seat that had the most empty seats around it, and he listened. He took notes in his paper book with a thin wooden instrument that scratched against the pages. He asked questions when invited to. His questions were thoughtful, specific, and always delivered in a voice that was calm and low. He never interrupted. He never argued. He never raised his voice. He was, by every measure the academy used, a perfect student. And the academy was terrified of him. HFY watched it happen from the edges. She watched how conversations died when Jakob entered a room. She watched how students rearranged their seats to maintain distance, never obvious about it, always with some excuse, a better angle on the display, a preference for natural light, a need to sit near the door. She watched how the Sauron, who feared nothing in the galaxy and made sure everyone knew it, avoided eye contact with the human as though his gaze was a weapon. She watched the instructors too. Professor Valeth, the Sauron combat theorist, was a veteran of 3 interstellar conflicts. He had scars across his armored hide that he wore with open pride. He had killed in battle and spoken of it in lectures without shame. But when Jakob sat in his class, Valeth never turned his back to him. Not once. He paced the front of the room, gesturing and lecturing with his usual force, but his body was always angled so that the human was in his line of sight. It was subtle enough that most students did not notice. HFY noticed. Headmaster Dreven was harder to read, being a gas-form entity without a fixed shape. But HFY had studied enough Ulwai culture to recognize the signs. Dreven monitored Jakob through tiny shifts in atmospheric pressure, invisible threads of attention that followed the human through corridors and classrooms like a web. The headmaster was watching, constantly. Jakob seemed to know. He never acknowledged it. He simply moved through his days with a quiet steadiness that Kethri found increasingly difficult to understand. He ate alone in the dining hall, choosing simple foods and consuming them without hurry. He studied alone in the grand study hall every evening, always in the same seat, always with his paper book. He walked the corridors alone, his footsteps soft and even, his hands in his pockets, his expression calm. He did not look lonely. That was what troubled Kethri most. He looked like a creature that was used to being alone. He looked like solitude was something he had made peace with a long time ago, and the thought of that made something in her chest ache in a way she did not expect. She was a chelith. Her species was built for connection. Every chelith was born into a cluster of sisters, raised in the warmth of the hive, surrounded by the constant hum of 1,000 minds working together. Loneliness was the cruelest punishment a chelith could face. To see someone carry it so easily, as if it weighed nothing, was either admirable or heartbreaking. She could not decide which. 3 weeks after Jakob's arrival, the moment came that changed everything. It happened in Professor Volith's class. The topic was evolutionary survival strategies, how each species had developed the traits that allowed it to survive long enough to reach the stars. It was a standard lecture, one that Volith gave every cycle, and it usually ended with a discussion of how these ancient strategies influenced modern diplomacy and warfare. Volith called on each species in turn. The Sauron spoke about size, strength, and natural armor. Their ancestors had been apex predators on a high-gravity world, and they had reached civilization through physical dominance. The Chelith described hive coordination, the ability to act as one mind across thousands of bodies, to solve problems collectively, to build structures that no individual could imagine alone. The Ulwai spoke of perception, of sensing the universe through vibrations and pressure changes that other species could not detect. The Dravni described speed and awareness, 6 eyes that could track motion in every direction, reflexes fast enough to dodge a particle beam. Each species told its story with pride. Each story was impressive. Then Volith turned to Jakob. The room went quiet, not the respectful silence of the grand study hall, but the tight, airless silence of a room full of creatures that were suddenly very aware of their own heartbeats. "Human," Volith said. His voice was neutral, but his body was tense. "Describe your species' evolutionary survival strategy." Jakob looked up from his notes. He set down his wooden writing tool. He was quiet for a moment, not searching for words, Kethri thought, but choosing them carefully. "We kept going," he said. The room waited. Volith's massive head tilted slightly. "Explain." Jakob leaned back in his seat. "Humans are not the fastest species on our planet. We are not the strongest. We do not have the best senses, the thickest skin, or the sharpest teeth. Almost every large predator on Earth could kill us in a direct fight, and for most of our history they did." He paused, the silence pressed in. "But we could do something that no other creature on our world could do. We could run. Not fast, slow, actually, but we could run for a very long time. Days if we needed to. Our bodies are designed for it. We sweat to cool ourselves, which means we don't overheat. We breathe in a rhythm that matches our stride. We have tendons in our legs that store energy like springs. We have a brain that can plan a route, remember landmarks, and predict where a target will be hours from now." He looked around the room. His forward-facing eyes moved from face to face, and Kethri saw the students flinch, one by one, as his gaze touched them. "Our ancestors hunted by following," he said. "They would pick a target, an animal faster and stronger than them, and they would follow it. Not chase. Follow. The animal would run away. It would sprint to safety. It would think it had escaped. And then an hour later the humans would appear again, walking, always walking. The animal would run again. It would escape again. And the humans would keep coming. They would follow that animal across plains, through rivers, over hills, under the sun, through the night, for as long as it took. Sometimes it took days." He stopped. The room was completely still. "Eventually," Jakob said, "the animal would fall. Not because it was caught, not because it was attacked, because it was exhausted, because its body could not run anymore. And the humans would walk up to it and it would be over. The silence in the room was the loudest thing HFY had ever heard. "That is our survival strategy," Jakob said. "We are the species that does not stop. We do not have the best weapons or the strongest armor or the fastest speed, but we will keep going after everything else has given up. We are not built to win quickly. We are built to win eventually." Nobody spoke. Even Valeth, who had fought in wars and seen terrible things, was motionless. His claws, which normally tapped against his lectern in a steady rhythm, were still. Jakob picked up his writing tool and looked down at his notes. "That is what kept us alive," he said quietly. "We learned to be patient." Valeth changed the subject. No one argued. That night, HFY sat in her sleeping alcove and opened the Galactic archives on her data tablet. She searched for humans with a hunger she had never felt for any other subject. She read for hours. She read about ice ages that had nearly killed them. They survived by wrapping themselves in the skins of dead animals and walking to warmer lands. She read about wars that had consumed entire continents. They rebuilt from the ashes every time. She read about a weapon they had created that split the fundamental building blocks of matter apart and released the energy of a star. And then they had used this weapon on their own kind, on their own cities, and killed hundreds of thousands of their own people in a flash of light. And then they kept going. They built more cities, they wrote more music, they reached for the stars. HFY closed her tablet and sat in the dark. She thought about a species that could invent the most beautiful music in the galaxy and the most terrible weapons in the same generation. She thought about a creature that could follow its prey for days without stopping, without resting, without ever giving up. She thought about Jakob sitting alone in the dining hall, eating in silence, patient as the species he came from. She was beginning to understand why the galaxy was afraid. It happened on a quiet night, 6 weeks after the human arrived. HFY was walking through the residential wing's lower corridor on her way back from a late study session. The lights were dimmed to simulate a night cycle, and the hallway was mostly empty. A few students moved between rooms, a pair of Dravni clicking softly to each other, an Olesi drifting along the wall with its color shifted to sleepy gray. The station hummed with the deep, constant vibration of its life support systems, a sound so familiar that no one heard it anymore. Then the sound changed. It started as a groan, a low, metallic noise that came from somewhere deep inside the station's bones. HFY stopped walking. Her wings lifted slightly from her back, an instinct that meant her body was preparing for flight before her mind had caught up. Around her, other students paused. The Dravni's 6 eyes went wide. The Olesi turned bright orange. The groan became a scream. The corridor shook. HFY was thrown sideways into the wall. The lights flickered, died, and were replaced by the harsh red pulse of emergency lighting. Alarms began to wail, a rising, falling sound that cut through the air like a blade. And then, from somewhere ahead of her, she heard a sound that every student at the Veyrath Academy had been taught to fear above all others. The rush of escaping atmosphere. Hull breach. Emergency bulkheads slammed down from the ceiling with a sound like thunder. They sealed the corridor into segments, each one a self-contained survival cell designed to preserve atmosphere until rescue teams arrived. HFY felt the bulkhead behind her crash into the floor just as she stumbled forward, and suddenly she was trapped in a section of corridor, roughly 30 meters long with a handful of other students. She counted them quickly. There was Vorith, the Sauron, massive and breathing hard, his armored hide scraping the ceiling as he turned. There was a young Ulwai student named Seal, a small cloud of blue-white gas hovering near the floor. There were 2 Chelith students she recognized from her cohort, Rien and Tala, both younger than her, both already pressing against each other in the instinctive Chelith fear cluster. There was a Dravni named Kas, all 6 of its eyes spinning in different directions as it tried to process what was happening. And there was Jakob. He was standing near the center of the corridor. He must have been walking back from the study hall as well. His bag was on the floor at his feet. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling, where a thin crack had appeared in the metal, a crack that was growing wider as Kethri watched. Air was leaving. She could feel it, a gentle pull, like the corridor was inhaling through the crack. It was not violent yet, but it would be. "The secondary seal is failing," Jakob said. His voice was level, calm, as if he were describing something he had read in a textbook. "The breach is above us, probably in the maintenance layer between this deck and the outer hull. The bulkheads have sealed our section, but if that crack opens further, we lose atmosphere." Nobody responded. Vorith was pressed against the far wall, his massive body tense. Rien and Tala were clicking rapidly to each other in low-frequency chelith, a sound that meant fear, fear, fear. Seal the Ulwai was flickering between colors, yellow to orange to red, and Kethri could see that the young gas form was losing cohesion. Without stable atmospheric pressure, an Ulwai would literally fall apart. Seal was already beginning to thin at the edges, wisps of blue-white gas drifting away from the main body like smoke. The temperature was dropping. The crack in the ceiling was pulling heat out along with the air. Kethri felt the cold creep into her limbs. Chelith were warm-climate creatures. Their exoskeletons were strong but thin, and their body chemistry slowed dangerously in low temperatures. If the temperature dropped much further, she would start to shut down. So would Rien and Tala. Kos the Dravni was pressed into a corner, its 6 eyes locked on the crack above. It was shaking. Jakob moved. He did not hesitate. He did not freeze. He did not look around the corridor with the wide, scattered gaze of a panicking creature. His eyes locked onto Seal, then onto the ceiling crack, then onto a maintenance panel on the wall, and his body followed his eyes with a precision that Kethri found almost frightening. He crossed to Seal first. The Ulwai was in real danger. Its body was dissipating with every drop in pressure. Jakob pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around the Ulwai's lower form, creating a crude barrier against the atmospheric loss. It was not a perfect solution, but it slowed the dissipation. Seal's color shifted from red to orange, still afraid but stabilizing. "Hold this around yourself," Jakob said to Seal. "Keep your form tight, you're going to be okay." Then he turned to the wall. There was a maintenance panel near the floor, a service access point that connected to the station's emergency environmental systems. Jakob dropped to his knees and began pulling at the panel's edge. It was sealed with magnetic locks designed to require a maintenance tool to open. Jakob did not have a maintenance tool. He dug his fingers into the gap between the panel and the wall and pulled. The metal bent. His fingers were bleeding, the edges of the panel were sharp, and human skin was soft, and the cold was making the metal brittle and cruel. He did not stop. He pulled harder. The panel groaned and came free, and behind it was a tangle of conduits, wires, and environmental control nodes. "Vorith," Jakob said. His voice had not changed, still calm, still steady. "The bulkhead behind you is bowing inward. The pressure differential is pushing it. I need you to brace it. Put your back against it and hold. Can you do that?" The Sauron stared at him. For a moment, Kethri thought Vorith would refuse, not out of defiance, but out of the simple paralysis that gripped every creature in the corridor. But something in Jakob's voice cut through the fear. It was not a command. It was a request made by someone who clearly expected it to be followed, and that certainty was more powerful than any order. Vorith moved. He pressed his enormous armored back against the bowing bulkhead and pushed. The metal groaned but held. "Good," Jakob said. He was already working inside the maintenance panel, his bleeding hands moving through the conduits with quick, sure movements. He was looking for the emergency pressure system, a backup that could seal minor breaches by flooding the area with compressed atmosphere. Every station had one. The question was whether it still worked. The temperature was still falling. Kethri felt her body beginning to slow. The cold was seeping through her exoskeleton, reaching the soft tissue beneath, and her muscles were tightening in ways she could not control. Her wings were locked completely now, frozen against her back like sheets of glass. Rien and Tala had stopped clicking. They were huddled together, motionless, their compound eyes dimming. Jakob looked over his shoulder and saw them. He saw Kethrai standing alone, her body rigid, her arms wrapped around herself. He crossed the corridor in 3 steps, took her arm and pulled her against his body. He was warm. The shock of it cut through the cold like a blade through ice. His body radiated heat, not the weak, ambient warmth of an external heat source, but a deep, internal fire that poured through his skin and into hers. She could feel his heartbeat through his chest, fast but steady, a rhythm that her own body began to match without her permission. She could feel his breath on the top of her head, warm and moist and alive. Humans were endothermic. They generated their own heat. Their bodies burned fuel constantly, maintaining an internal temperature that was higher than most environments they lived in. They were furnaces wrapped in soft skin, and in this freezing corridor, Jakob Morrow was the warmest thing in the world. He held her with one arm and reached back into the maintenance panel with the other. He was working by touch now, his fingers tracing conduits, finding connections, rerouting power. He talked while he worked, not to her, but to the room. Kas, I need you to tell me if the crack gets wider. Watch it with all 6 eyes. Vorith, keep holding. Rien, Tala, stay together, share body heat. Nobody dies in this corridor, not tonight. His voice was the only sound besides the alarms. It filled the space the way Headmaster Dreven's presence filled a room, not with volume, but with certainty. He spoke as though the outcome was already decided, as though survival was not a possibility but a fact, and all they needed to do was wait for the universe to catch up. Kethrai heard something click inside the wall, then a hiss, then a rush of warm air that flooded the corridor like a wave. The emergency pressure system activated. Compressed atmosphere poured through vents in the ceiling, filling the corridor, sealing the crack with a barrier of positive pressure that pushed outward against the vacuum. The temperature began to rise. The pull of escaping air stopped. Seal's gas form solidified. Rien and Tala began to move. Kas made a sound, a high, rapid clicking that meant relief in the Dravni language. Minutes later, the rescue teams arrived. The bulkheads opened. Medical crews swarmed in, scanning and treating and asking questions in a dozen languages. Jakob sat against the wall. His hands were wrapped in strips torn from his undershirt, the blood soaking through the fabric. He was breathing hard now, deep, shaking breaths that racked his whole body. Kethrai realized that he was trembling, not from cold, from adrenaline. She had read about this in the archives. Humans produced a chemical in moments of extreme danger, a hormone that flooded their muscles with energy, dulled their pain receptors, and focused their minds to a razor point. It was called adrenaline, and it was the reason humans did not freeze when they were afraid. It was the reason they ran toward danger instead of away from it. Their bodies were designed to turn fear into fuel. The trembling was what happened after. When the danger passed and the chemical drained away, the body shook. It was not weakness. It was the engine cooling down. Kethrai sat beside him. She did not speak. She did not need to. Jakob looked at his bloody hands and laughed, a soft, quiet sound that was nothing like a threat display. It was the sound of a creature that had just done something impossible and could not quite believe it. "Everyone okay?" he asked. "Yes," Kethrai said. Her voice was small, but it was steady. "Because of you." He looked at her. His forward-facing eyes, those predator eyes that had terrified her 6 weeks ago, were soft now, tired, and full of something she had not expected to find there. "Kindness." He shook his head. "I just knew where the panel was," he said. "You all did the hard part. You survived." It was such a human thing to say, to refuse credit, to deflect attention, to act as though holding a freezing alien against his chest while rerouting a space station's emergency systems with bleeding hands was nothing special. The rescue team took him to the medical bay. He walked on his own feet. He did not ask for help. HFY watched him go and felt the last traces of his warmth fading from her exoskeleton. She stood in the ruined corridor and thought about what she had just seen. A predator that chose to protect. A creature built for pursuit that used its endurance to save lives. A species that turned fear into action and action into survival. She thought about his hands, those soft, blunt, clawless hands, torn open on metal because he had refused to stop working. For the first time since his arrival, HFY was not afraid of the human. She was afraid of what the galaxy would become if it could not learn to see him clearly. The Academy did not change overnight. HFY had not expected it to. Fear was old. It lived in the deep parts of the brain, in the blood, in the chemical signals that species had carried for millions of years before they ever looked up at the stars. You could not remove fear with a single act of courage, no matter how great that act was. You could only plant something beside it and hope it grew. In the days after the breach, the station underwent repairs. Engineers sealed the damaged section. Inspectors filed reports. Headmaster Dreven issued a calm statement assuring students that the structural failure was isolated and would not repeat. Life at the Academy resumed its normal rhythm: lectures, study sessions, meals, the quiet flow of 100 species learning to share space. But something was different. It was small at first. A Dravni student, not Kos, but one of his clustermates, sat one seat closer to Jakob in the dining hall, not next to him, just one seat closer than before. The next day, a Sauron student nodded at Jakob as they passed in the corridor. It was a tiny movement, barely visible on that massive armored head, but HFY saw it. Jakob nodded back. The HFY student seal began hovering near Jakob during study sessions. Not close enough to be intrusive, but close enough to be noticed. Seal's color, whenever Jakob was nearby, was a steady blue, the HFY expression of trust. The fear was still there. HFY could feel it in the way students still went quiet when Jakob entered a room, in the way the Sauron still watched him from the corners of their eyes, in the way Headmaster Dreven's atmospheric thread still followed him through the corridors. But the silence was changing. It was no longer the silence of a room full of creatures frozen in terror. It was the silence of a room full of creatures thinking, reconsidering, trying to fit a new shape into a space where it did not quite belong. 1 week after the breach, HFY went to the medical bay. Jakob was there, sitting on the edge of a treatment platform while a medical drone finished sealing the last of his lacerations. His hands were wrapped in thin, regenerative bandages that glowed faintly blue. He looked tired. Not exhausted, just the kind of tired that comes from healing, from letting the body do the slow work of putting itself back together. He looked up when she entered. His forward-facing eyes found her immediately, and she felt the old instinct flicker in her chest, the cold tightness, the urge to flatten her wings and pull away. But she held still. She let the feeling pass through her like a wave, and when it was gone, she stepped forward. "May I sit?" she asked. He looked surprised. It was the first time she had seen that expression on his face, a slight widening of his eyes, a small lift of his eyebrows. It made him look younger. It made him look like what he was, a student far from home, alone in a place that feared him. "Of course," he said. She sat on the platform across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The medical bay hummed softly around them, the drones moving between stations, the air warm and clean and sterile. "I wanted to ask you something," HFY said. "I have wanted to ask it since the day you arrived." Jakob tilted his head. Another predator gesture, the rotation of the skull to aim the forward-facing eyes more precisely. But HFY did not flinch. "Go ahead," he said. "Why are you not angry at us?" The question hung in the air between them. HFY felt her wings shift against her back, not locked in fear this time, but restless with the weight of what she was saying. "You came here alone," she continued. You walked into a hall full of species that treated you like a disease. No one sat near you. No one spoke to you. The instructors watched you like you were a weapon that might go off at any moment. You ate alone every day for 6 weeks, and you never once raised your voice or showed anger or demanded to be treated differently. She paused. I would have been furious. Any Chelith would have been. To be separated from the group, to be forced into isolation, for us, that is the worst thing you can do to a person. Why did you accept it? Jakob was quiet for a long time. He looked down at his bandaged hands and turned them over slowly, studying the blue glow of the regenerative wrappings. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. Because I understand, he said. Kethri waited. I know what I look like to you, he continued. I know what my species looks like. We have forward-facing eyes. We show our teeth when we are happy. We are comfortable in silence. We can run for days without stopping. We come from a world that is, by your standards, a nightmare. He paused. And our history is full of violence. We have done terrible things to each other and to our world. I would be a fool to pretend that none of that is real. He looked up at her. His eyes were steady, and for the first time, Kethri did not see a predator's focus in them. She saw something more complicated, something that contained sadness and acceptance and a quiet, stubborn hope. Being frightening and being monstrous are not the same thing, he said. I am frightening. My species is frightening. I cannot change what we are, but I can choose what I do with it. I can choose to sit in a room where everyone is afraid of me and not give them a reason to be right. Kethri felt something shift inside her. It was not the removal of fear. The fear was still there, and she suspected it always would be. It was the arrival of something else, something that grew up beside the fear and made room for itself. Where I come from, Jakob said, we have a saying. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is deciding that something else matters more. The words settled into the silence of the medical bay like stones dropping into still water. Kethri turned them over in her mind. She thought about the grand study hall, about the sacred silence, about the thousands of generations of students who had sat in that quiet and learned to be civilized. She thought about how the academy defined strength as armor, as speed, as the ability to survive through power or numbers or perception. She thought about a species that defined strength as the ability to keep going when everything else had stopped. A species that carried its fear not as a burden but as a fuel. A species that had looked at a universe full of creatures stronger and faster and more dangerous than itself and said, "We will not stop." "Thank you," she said. It was a small word and it did not contain everything she wanted to say, but it was enough. Jakob smiled. She saw his teeth white and blunt and harmless, and she did not feel the cold tightness in her chest. She felt warmth. The memory of his body heat in the frozen corridor, the steady drumbeat of his heart against her exoskeleton, the sound of his voice saying nobody dies tonight. She returned to her quarters and did not sleep, not because of fear, because she was thinking. 2 weeks later, on an ordinary morning during the regular study cycle, Kethri walked into the grand study hall early. She passed the rows of crystal platforms, walked past her usual seat near the eastern wall and sat down in the chair directly beside Jakob Morrow's usual spot. She placed her data tablets on the platform. She opened her notes. She waited. When Jakob walked in, he stopped. He stood in the aisle between the platforms, his bag over his shoulder, his paper book tucked under his arm. He looked at Kethri sitting in the seat beside his. He looked at the space she had saved for him, the empty platform, clean and waiting. Kethri looked back at him. Her mandibles clicked together once, the Chelith expression of welcome, of opening, of a door being held for someone who had been standing outside in the cold. Something moved across his face. It was not surprise this time, and it was not relief. It was something deeper, something that came from the same place in the human body that produced adrenaline and warmth and music and the will to run across a continent without stopping. His eyes glistened. His jaw tightened. He took a breath. Then he smiled. And Kethri smiled back in the Chelith way, a ripple of her wings, a softening of her compound eyes, a vibration that she hoped he could feel even if he could not see it. He sat down beside her. He opened his paper book. She opened her data tablet. They began to study, side by side, in the sacred silence of the grand study hall. Around them, the hall was filling with students. The Sauron came first, settling into their seats with the usual rumble of heavy bodies and clinking armor. Then the Dravni, quick and clicking. Then the Ulwai, drifting in like clouds at sunrise. One by one, species by species, the hall came alive with the quiet presence of 100 different kinds of minds. Seal the Ulwai drifted down from the upper reaches of the hall and settled into a spot just behind Jakob. The young gas form's color was a steady, brilliant blue. Kos the Dravni took a seat 2 rows away and aimed at least 3 of its 6 eyes toward the human with something that looked, for the first time, like curiosity instead of fear. And then, slowly, carefully, as though testing the waters of a river they had been afraid to cross, other students began to move closer. A Chelith from another cohort took the seat on Kethri's other side. An Olesi settled onto the platform across from Jakob, its skin shifting to a warm green that Kethri had never seen it wear before. Even Voreth, the massive Sauron who had braced the bulkhead with his body, lowered himself into a nearby seat with a slow nod that carried more respect than any words could have expressed. The seats around the human filled, not all of them, not quickly, but enough to see. The silence of the grand study hall held. It was the same silence that had existed for 12,000 cycles, ancient, sacred, and heavier than starlight. But inside it, something had changed. The silence no longer pressed down on the room like a weight. It opened outward, like a space being made bigger from the inside, like a hall that was learning to hold one more kind of mind within its crystal walls. Jakob turned a page of his paper book. Kethri adjusted her data tablet. Their shoulders were close enough to touch, though they did not. Outside the crystal walls, the stars turned slowly in the dark. Somewhere far away, a small blue-green planet orbited an unremarkable yellow star, and on that planet, the species that never stopped was still running, still building, still reaching out into a universe that was only just beginning to understand what it meant to be human. Inside the hall, the silence held. It was no longer the silence of terror. It was the silence of a room that was learning at last that the most terrifying thing in the galaxy was also the most worth knowing.